About living a long time is that when I think about that bio, I remember when $150 million was a lot of money.
Yeah.
You know, now that's like a couple of deals. One 3-bedroom ranch home in Saratoga. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I just wanted to see, to talk to you a little bit about business opportunities today. And I know that's a kind of an unusual topic around here, but by a show of hands, how many of you have ever participated in a sale of a business opportunity? Okay, so that's a third of you probably. And I think all of you know too that I like to move around. But here, by another show of hands, how many people find that irritating? Because, you know, Yin says, you know, why do you move around? You know, people are complaining, they can't hear you. And I think, well, you know, standing at the podium is what's irritating to me. I think that's really boring, but, you know, what I think is boring is maybe not what you think is boring. In any event, the reason why I wanted to talk to you about business opportunities today is that I find that it comes up a lot in my practice. And as a real estate licensee, as I am, just like you, as a former active commercial real estate broker, I know that this job is very, very difficult. And so whenever I come to speak with you, I try to come to you and talk to you about things that will frankly help you to make money. Okay, I mean, how many of you are here today just for fun? Margaret, you're special. I've been saying that about you for a long time. Most of us are here because we're trying to earn a living, okay? And so we enjoy the benefit of association with our friends and exchange of information, which helps us to earn a living. You're here to hear something from me today that will help you to earn a living. I'm here because it helps promote my practice. So that's not a surprise, and I like to kind of get that out there so you understand what we're doing here today and why I hope it will be value to you. Now, a business opportunity is just a sale of a business, and the moniker business opportunity is something that's come up over time as sort of a euphemism for the sale of business. Although it's been pointed out to me before that when you sell a business opportunity, it's only a business opportunity, not a business guarantee. Okay? And so that difference is something I want to talk to you about today, because I think it's really important when you're going out into the marketplace to discuss and to market businesses. We've already been through my bio. The only thing I'll add, Brian, is that today I'm actually the chair of the real property law section for the State Bar of California. And so I think your bio is outdated. Sorry, I'll have to send you the new one. So, you know, I called the subtitle to this presentation 10% commissions. Now, how many of you have heard of 10% commissions? How many of you received a 10% commission? They're rare, okay? But they're possible with business opportunities because that was the customary rate for the sale of a business opportunity, a 10% commission, much like a land transaction, historically, customarily, was a 10% commission. Like everything else in this community, that number is fungible and negotiable. And so I won't tell you that the sale of a business opportunity today will necessarily lead to a 10% commission, but it can. And I think that's a very attractive number. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is the different shapes of business opportunities and some important tips for realtors when you're going to go out and sell these things. So things that you need to know about, things you need to be afraid of. Okay. And I think they're very important things. They don't have to be fearsome to you, but like everything else you do as a realtor, it's important for you to be competent in what you do before you try to go out and do it. Okay. So today, we're going to talk basically about why you should be considering adding business opportunities to your repertoire. We're going to tell you a little bit about the difference between the sale of business opportunities and, let's say, residential real estate, which is probably what is the main focus of most of the people in this room. We're going to talk to you about some brief tips about things that you really need to know before you go out and sell businesses and to understand what the logic is behind them and what buyers are looking for, as well as important things you need to watch out for, because unfortunately the sale of business opportunities is much less structured than the sale of residential real estate. I'm fond of telling people that residential real estate is the most complex transaction there is in real estate and one of the hardest things in the world to do. There's so many regulations, requirements, disclosures, and different types of laws and statutes customs that prevail in the sale of residential real estate, it's actually a lot more complicated than like selling an apartment building, even though an apartment building may be a much larger transaction. Okay, so I want to remind you all today that although I'm a lawyer, I'm not necessarily your lawyer. I am for some of the people in this room, but we're not forming an attorney-client relationship today. Although I have a tax degree, I'm not offering you any tax advice, nor am I offering you any legal advice, and that this is purely an educational seminar, even though it's being recorded. So why should you look at business opportunities? Well, first of all, they're everywhere. Okay, there are lots and lots of businesses. You drive down the street, you see commercial every place. And every single one of those spaces, assuming that it's occupied, has a business operating in it. The other thing is that business opportunities frequently change hands. And often that's of no fault of the business, but it's actually due to the fault of the operator. So how many of you sold the same house 3 times in 1 year? Doesn't happen too often, right? How many of you seen restaurants change hands 3 times in 1 year? Okay. Restaurants are very highly or well known to be very difficult businesses to operate with a very high risk of failure. Well, there's a reason for that, but as the the broker of the business, you're really not that preoccupied with that. Your job is to, of course, enable the seller to sell that business to the next buyer. We also live in a very entrepreneurial community. A community of immigrants. How many people in this room were born in another country? Most of us came from someplace else, and all of us came from someplace else at one point, if you go far enough back in our genealogy. My own view, and my opinion only, is that in this community we are particularly entrepreneurial. There are many people who own small businesses and want to own small businesses. There are lots of reasons for that. Part of it, I believe, is cultural. But part of it's also that when people come to these shores, they're often trained and educated in another place, and sometimes licensed in another place for a certain profession. They could be medical doctors, engineers, lawyers. And sometimes when they come here, either because of the language barrier, because of their age at that time, or because they are having just difficulty being licensed here, or the educational requirements here are so different from where they came from, they can no longer apply their trades here. So if I'm a doctor in Taiwan and I come to the United States, I have to take medical licensing examinations before I'm allowed to practice medicine here. So when I come here, what do? If I have money, I don't really want to get a job working for somebody else or working perhaps as a physician's assistant, because sort of a step down if I'm already a doctor someplace else. So instead, I might choose to open my own business. And so I think that that's part of what we see in why so many people are drawn to businesses here. It also means that language barriers, which are sometimes an impediment to immigrants, don't really apply. You know, if I have a donut store and I'm selling donuts across the counter, I really only need to speak so much English in order to be able to do that. And you know, this is a great country that way. So I have an opportunity to earn a living and to be a business for myself where I am my own boss. And I don't have to have complete mastery of the English language. Now, businesses at the same time can be quite substantial investments. I mean, restaurants can sell for over $1 million. If you're familiar with coin-operated laundromats, which I've done a number of transactions in and a lot of litigation, and frankly, you know, I've done them before up to $1.5 million. And that's a pretty good-sized store, but not the biggest store. So these can be rather large investments, and then, of course, there are fairly large commissions that are involved in their sale. The other thing is that buyers are often drawn to cash businesses. And that's another euphemism that we'll talk about a little bit more. But basically, people want to operate businesses which have little or no documentation about the amount of income that's being realized. And I'm sure they have their reasons for that. We'll talk about some of those reasons in a moment. The other thing is that it is required that you have a real estate license in order to sell a business opportunity. So if you see anybody who's selling businesses and they don't have a license, you should turn them into the DRE because they are cutting into your paycheck. And as I said before, 10% commissions is another reason for you to want to be involved in the sale of a business opportunity. So what are some of the differences? Well, usually there's no real property transfer involved. Okay? And now sometimes a business is sold with the real estate underneath. And probably the most common example is a restaurant business, because they're often in a standalone building with a parking lot, something like that. It could be on an out pad in a larger retail facility or something like that. And so that would be an exception. But otherwise, usually the business is sold by itself with a lease instead. Now, again, one other difference between business opportunities and a normal residential transaction is that it is an income-producing asset. And so there's some level of financial analysis that's involved in it. It's not, per se, financial analysis that you should be involved in. It's analysis that the buyer has to participate in. And we're going to talk about that in a minute when we get to more of the questions about problems in transactions and things that you should avoid doing. The other difference is that because businesses are not sold with required reporting of the financial transaction, there is a relative lack of comparable sales data for valuation purposes. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, when we sell a piece of real estate, we know that that transaction is recorded in the county and a documentary transfer tax is paid on the amount of that sale. So it automatically generates a very large amount of data. If I'm going to sell a house at 123 Main Street and the house next door at 121 Main Street sells, I have a pretty good idea that those homes were built at the same time, that they have similar configuration, and that the 121 Main Street sale is going to be fairly comparable to my proposed sale of 123 Main Street. But if I have a restaurant at the corner of Main and Elm and a restaurant at the corner of San Gabriel and Valley Boulevard, I don't really know what the Main and Elm sale was because the sale amounts are not reported anywhere. They don't have to be reported any place. And sometimes when the information is reported, frankly, it's not very accurate to the extent there is reporting. So we don't really have the type of body of information that we normally have to go out and value these things. And you should avoid valuation exercises with these businesses. The other counterpart idea to that is that there can be a substantial variation in price from one seemingly similar business to another. Okay, and you see this very, very often with restaurants, with laundromats too. It could be other service type businesses, a nail salon, a donut shop, those kinds of things. One might sell for $50,000, another might sell for $300,000. And it's sometimes hard to explain what the difference is because they look like they might be about the same size. Okay? And so because, frankly, number one, we don't have very good reporting information, and so sometimes the perceived value of that business opportunity is different from one buyer to the other. That might explain the difference. The other thing is that the buyer may have some particular understanding of that business that causes that buyer to believe that it's worth something more. And the third thing is that the seller may be so sick of that business that they just want to get out. And sometimes that results in a very low sale price. I was involved in a litigation matter that involved the sale of a coin-operated laundromat. My clients sold a coin-operated laundromat for $1,630,000. 4 years later, the buyer sold it for $565,000. Margaret says they lost a lot of money. That's a very clever observation. You get a pen? Yeah, they lost a lot of money. Okay, and then they sued us, and we beat them, and they lost a bunch more. Okay, so there are reasons for all of this, and there are things that you need to know about that in order to stay out of trouble there. The brokers were sued in that transaction, and their carriers did pay a settlement in that litigation, although I don't think they should have because we really had no liability. But they had an insurance company to write a check, and so they did. What you need to know about different types of business opportunities in terms of things to know is that each one has a different way to value it. Okay? And so when you look at restaurants, they're not going to be the same as, for instance, a coin-operated laundromat. Some are sold on the basis of gross income. Others are sold on the basis of net profit. What I mean by that is much like an apartment building is sold on a multiplier, there's a multiplier that's applied to the sale of that business opportunity. And everybody has a different rule. For instance, some people will say a coin-operated laundromat should sell for 40 times the net monthly profit. Where does that number come from? Who knows? Okay. Because it's not a hard and fast rule. There's no, again, no particular reporting of the information that could kind of comprise the marketplace. And so the answer is that this sort of just comes up as a rule of thumb that brokers and people who are active in the marketplace start to use as a number. And obviously the number will range up and down from that figure. And it will change over time, depending on the economy and depending on the marketplace. The other thing is that there is financing available for business opportunities, but it's not the kind of consistent, readily available marketplace for financing that we see in the sale of a single-family home, and even that is less predictable these days. There is small business administration financing available and seller carryback financing available. And I would particularly say that when you're working with a buyer that, and a seller offers seller carryback financing, I think that's a particularly good sign. And the reason why I say that is because there's a great deal of fraud in these transactions, and anytime the seller is willing to carry paper, it suggests he or she is not going to cheat the buyer. I did a lawsuit in February that went to trial, actually in arbitration, and one of the issues that we raised, we were defending. We had been accused of over-reporting the income for the coin-operated laundromat, and we made the point that when my client purchased the laundromat, he bought it for 5% down, and the seller carried back $400,000. My client, who was initially the buyer, paid off all the financing, including a small balloon after he sold the laundromat of about $15,000 or $20,000, I don't recall now. And we made the point that if my client had been cheated by the last seller and then cheated the next buyer, why would my client pay off the financing? I mean, if you've been cheated for something and you still owe that person money, the first thing you're going to do is stop payment, right? And the court looked at that and agreed that that was an indicator that my client had not been cheated when he purchased the business, and that because he had not been cheated, he did not cheat the next buyer because the income levels were consistent. Now, the other important thing to know about a business opportunity is that because you don't own the land underneath, you've got something that sometimes in financial terms you refer to as a sinking fund. You've got an asset that depreciates on its own. So if you have a lease for 5 years, in effect, and this isn't exactly right, but that you could think of that lease as depreciating 20% per year. So if you pay $10,000 to buy that business, you have to make back the $10,000 that you paid within the 5 years, plus whatever profit you want to have for operating. Okay. And so that's part of the consideration that the buyer makes when they're trying to evaluate whether it's a good investment or not. Remember, there are not a lot of rules about this. It's just something that you need to be aware of. And you, as the real estate broker, have to be somewhat familiar with the lease so that you can provide that document to your client. Again, you don't want to make any legal interpretation of the lease, but you can read the lease and determine how many years are left on the balance of the lease and whether or not there are any options. Okay? And that's very important, because if I'm going to make a more substantial investment in a business, let's say it's $100,000 and it's very, very profitable, I want to know how long I can operate it, because it might be at the end of that period that the landlord refuses to renew my lease, and now I've got a business that's worth nothing because I don't have any place to operate it. And I can't just move it unless there's a space open next door without a substantial loss of goodwill. Does everybody follow that idea that, if I've got a really, who has a favorite restaurant? Okay, everybody has a favorite restaurant. Most of us have more than one. And we know, how many of us know where it is? Okay, just a hunch. I just wanted to check, see if you're paying any attention. But if it moves around the corner, unless there's a sign and you noticed it and you remembered the sign and so forth, when it's gone, it's just gone. You can't follow it to the next place. I don't know if you all remember everybody go to Happy Bakery? It's just up the street here on Valley. I love Happy Bakery. Remember when Happy Bakery burned down there at the corner of Valley and 9th? I mean, I wept, okay? Because I love Happy Bakery so much. And they disappeared for years. They didn't reopen. And then we just stumbled across them just a few blocks down the street on Valley, right? And I was so happy. Well, it's the same thing, okay? If the landlord decides to step in and not renew your lease, your business is gone. Okay? And so therefore, you need to evaluate what you're willing to pay for that business. Depends on what your return is going to be before you're forced to divest it, to get rid of it. And a lot of the time, the unscrupulous landlord, if it's an unscrupulous landlord, will not renew the lease because, frankly, he or she can step in and operate his own business there and pick up your very successful business. And this is very true in businesses like a coin-operated laundromat, where there's relatively little personality or less personality involved than, let's say a restaurant. With a restaurant, the guys or women who are cooking behind the stove make a difference, right? I mean, you go to this place because the noodles here are exactly the way you expect them. The next person who steps in can't duplicate that as much as they're going to try. So it's a lot harder for them to do that. But in another business which is more fungible, let's say a nail salon, if that tenant is not renewed and you just find a new tenant to step in, the landlord can actually sell the business to the new tenant because basically it's there. The improvements are there, the business is going to keep coming there, and he can actually, or she can actually pick up some value from that. So you've got to be aware of what the lease terms are because it does heavily affect the value of that business and should affect the considerations of the client. The next thing is that cash businesses mean you've got unreliable records. Okay? And how many people have heard before about people keeping 2 sets of books? How many people have heard before of people keeping no sets of books? How many people have heard of people who keep books but it doesn't matter whether they kept them or not? Right? So, the reason why people are drawn to cash businesses is because they are cash businesses. But because they are cash businesses, the records are notoriously unreliable. Which set of lies should I believe? This set of lies or that set of lies? Okay? And I don't want to overstate this because what I've found in the sale of businesses is that brokers tell me that actually the frequency of somebody completely misrepresenting the numbers is actually pretty low. Okay? It's surprising, right? But it does happen, and it illustrates the fact that you don't have good, reliable records or a way to confirm that information. The other thing that's a point that I raised earlier is that more often than not, the success or failure of that business is actually determined by the operator. How many of you are familiar with a restaurant called Tasty Noodle House? Do you know what anybody familiar with that one? Do you know where Golden Deli is? Corner of New and Main Street. Well, in the corner at the corner of that shopping center was a very small restaurant space. And I watched 6 restaurants cycle through there in 5 years, probably. But there's been one lady who's been there now the last 3 years. And she's very, very successful, and the place is very, very busy. But I'd always thought that it was a lousy location and nobody done well. But it really was the operator. In the past, there'd never been a competent operator in that location. My father's in the Chinese restaurant business. He's one of the early kind of pioneers in the Mandarin restaurant business. And he bought a failed Chinese restaurant. Happens to be in Hollywood, virtually at the corner of Hollywood and Highland Avenue. Everybody said, well, you're going to do badly there because the last guys went out. But it turned out that my father was extremely successful there, and that restaurant's been there for 50 years. And that the little tiny building is very, very valuable today because that, if you know anything about Hollywood, is directly across the street from the Hollywood Highland Project, and it's ground zero. So it shows you that the talent of the operator will make the bigger difference. Unfortunately, what happens is that the buyers don't agree. okay? And they believe when they step in and they don't duplicate the success of the seller, that they have been cheated, okay? And that's where a lot of litigation comes in. I had a client who owned a Latino grocery store. He himself was not of Latino heritage, but his wife was from Costa Rica and he spoke fluent Spanish. And he operated the cash register and he understood that community, he understood that business, he understood in that community very often people don't have checking accounts, they don't have bank accounts. And they receive paychecks and they have to cash those paychecks. So he would cash their paychecks for them in his grocery store on the condition that they spent 5 or 10% roughly of the amount of their paycheck when they came in to shop. And he knew what products they wanted to have, and they were pleasant, and they spoke Spanish with people at the cash register, and he was very successful. He sold that business to a gentleman who was from Korea. The gentleman from Korea was not married to a woman from Costa Rica, did not speak Spanish, did not cash checks for people in that community, did not understand the importance of that, did not understand what products they needed to own or to sell in order to be successful, and his business sunk like a stone. He, of course, immediately assumed that he had been cheated, and he sued my client. We, of course, convinced him that he was wrong, many thousands of dollars later, and he just went away. Okay. So this is one of the problems with business opportunities. Again, it gives you an opportunity to sell the same business over and over again, but it does raise the specter of potential litigation because people think that the fault is with the seller and not with themselves. The other point I'll make to you is that a good escrow is really important, and I know there are at least a couple of really good escrows in this room. So they can help answer your questions because there are a lot of complex issues in the sale of the business opportunity that involve bulk sale transfers, often liquor license transfers, and things of that nature. Quite frankly, I talk to the escrows because they know more about that than I do. But I want you to be aware of that. Remember when you're talking to your friends in escrow about who has a lot of good experience with this in order for them to assist you. So be careful. Because this area is very different from residential, there are things that you need to know about it and in order to be on guard. The first thing is that the purchase forms themselves are often very poorly written. You know, the CAR, Residential Purchase Agreement, the RPA is 8 pages long, I think, or 10 pages long, 8 pages long, I think. It's like 6-point type, okay? You look at the sale of a coin-operated laundromat business, and it's about 150 words, single page, one side, okay? And it's not very good. And it's a very dangerous document, and it often leads to litigation. Even though there are few, what we call caveats, disclaimers in that document, they're really insufficient for most purposes. So CAR gives us lots of really great documents to use in the sale of residential, and actually, I think commercial forms as well. But those safeguards are often omitted from these documents that are usually generated by the brokers themselves, and they're just not very good. Don't make representations. Okay? And this is funny, because in real estate, we know that we are required in the sale of a single-family home to make a reasonably diligent visual inspection of the real property and disclose any perceived defects. The problem with the business is that I can walk into the restaurant and I see tables and chairs, there's some customers, there's a refrigerator with some beer in it. But, you know, what can I really say about it? That the sales were $30,000 last month? That the operator makes $10,000 a month profit? I really don't know those things. And unless I have independently verified that information, I cannot offer that observation without stating that I have not verified the information, that it's based on information provided by the seller, that those numbers are estimates, and that the buyer should conduct his or her own investigation. The other thing is you're not an appraiser unless you're an appraiser. So don't conduct an appraisal. Be careful of valuation exercises. It's valuation of these types of investments. Like I said, because of the lack of solid information, is really more of an art than a science. This was my point I raised a moment ago, that the information that you offer is not verified by the agent. The buyer purchases solely based on the buyer's investigation. Remember, that even though you may talk about the information about what the seller represents was the past income, that there are no warranties of future performance for the reasons that I cited. First of all, no one knows what the future will hold. But secondly, we don't know what the skill of the operator is. And again, this isn't like an apartment building. Pretty much the building is always the same. Even with an apartment building, the skill of the operator can make a difference. But with a restaurant business, the skill of the operator is everything. Because it's a cash business, it means that the possibility of fraud is always present. So it's very hard to verify that past income, and you have to be sure that you have made that very clear to your client, that your client is prepared and experienced with this type of investment, and if not, that they're going to go out and obtain the kind of training and education that they need to have in order to be successful in that business. This reminds me then of a case I had almost 10 years ago now, the sushi bar case. And in the sushi bar case, the agent, who happened to be Korean, runs an ad in the Korean Times, and he says, sushi bar for sale, Japanese seller, looks very reliable. Now, it's interesting. In this case, everyone was Korean. That is, the buyers were Korean, the sellers were Korean, the seller's lawyer was Korean. I'm a Chinese guy. And
Japanese seller.
you're right, okay. And it turns out that in the Korean community, the perception is that Japanese people are very honest. And you know, and I think that's you know, a perception that might be true in the Chinese community too, that we think the Japanese people are very honest. You know? No? Well, I like to think that everybody's honest. There are noteworthy exceptions. In any event, he runs the ad this way because they are trying to induce reliance. They're saying, because the sellers are Japanese, you know the books are very reliable. The only problem with it is that, number one, the guy never audited the books or reviewed the books himself, so how did he know the books were very reliable? The other problem happened to be that his client, who was Korean, coincidentally, was actually flipping the restaurants to the next Korean buyer. The Japanese sellers, the original sellers, actually were very honest and did have very accurate books. The Korean resellers in the middle cooked the books and passed them on to the buyer. The buyers met the Japanese sellers and said, oh, Japanese sellers, very honest. Not realizing that the Korean resellers in the middle were less than honest. Okay. And it turned out that as I said, the Korean resellers cooked the books. We caught them, we sued them. It was over $1 million. It was actually 4 sushi bars. It was kind of a chain of restaurants. It turned out that they then took the position that the false books that they had provided to my clients were projections, and that they were given to my clients saying that this is what the business could possibly do, not what it's actually doing. The problem was that they had gone out and gotten a loan from a Korean bank and told the Korean bank the same lies, that this was the income that they were actually doing, not what they were possibly doing. And so we caught them there and obtained $1 million judgment against them. And by the way, the real estate agent. The real estate agent had performed no verification of the information. He had put no disclaimer or caveat in the advertising saying that the information was unverified. I find that this reference to a quote-unquote Japanese seller is very questionable and would place your license probably in some jeopardy, because you shouldn't make any observations about the ethnicity of anybody, the sale of anything. And he didn't even earn any commissions. Now, you are not required to earn a commission in order to be liable for harm to a third party. It is not a required element of a cause of action against the real estate agent. So in this case, it turned out that, quite frankly, that the Korean resellers then kind of turned on him and they just refused to pay him, so he got no commissions. Gets sued anyway, ends up with $1 million judgment. Okay? So I think that's about the end of our time. I just want to remind you in terms of what we talked about today, that remember business opportunities are everywhere, that you need a license to sell one, but it's a good chance for you to look to some additional business. It's something that you might be able to do in the course of your work. You all work with business owners when you sell real estate or listing real estate or selling real estate, and sometimes these other opportunities will come along. You got to do your homework though to get familiar with that. Don't do any appraisals. Make sure you have the proper disclaimers in all of your documents. Anytime you give anybody anything, it should say this information is unverified, it's been provided by the seller, it's merely an estimate. You know, the buyer must conduct his own investigations in order to determine whether or not this investment is suitable to him or her. Don't make any representations. Remember that the operator performance often dictates success and failure, and therefore whether or not there's going to be a lawsuit when it's done. And call me if you have any questions. I hope you've all found this helpful. Remember, we're all here to help you. We want to help you make more money. We don't want you to